Welcome to Vendetta Sports Media. My name is James Herrick, and today I am here to do a film study on UFC welterweight champion Leon Edwards in anticipation of his trilogy fight against Kamaru Usman at UFC 286. If you haven't already, make sure you go and check out the previous film study that I did on Kamaru Usman because we have both sides of this trilogy covered. And if you haven't watched one of these film studies before, basically what I do is I will look at some film and I will analyze two strengths and two weaknesses of a fighter's game, and then I will kind of create some game plans on how that fighter can win a fight and how you can potentially beat that fighter. And that is what we are doing today for Leon Edwards. The first strength of Leon Edwards' game that I really like is his ability to manipulate his opponent's head movement. So what this means is that he will throw shots and he will draw out the opponent's head movement. And when the opponent moves their head, he will then hit them from the opposite direction. So what that would look like is he would throw a jab, the opponent would move their head, say in this direction, and then the strike would come in this direction. So essentially, what that means is the opponent tries to avoid the first strike and they get hit by a second strike that they don't see coming and that they're moving into. Now, this is a really good way to set up strikes, but it also makes those strikes land with a lot of power. And this is something that he's done really well throughout his career. So this is one we're going to look at, and there's a lot of clips here and a lot of examples of him successfully doing that. All right, so in this clip, we see Leon Edwards throw a jab, and this jab actually misses Kamaru Usman, and it goes on the right side of Kamaru Usman's head. But what that does is it forces Kamaru Usman to move to that opposite direction, and when he moves to that opposite direction, Leon cracks him with a strong hook. This is a similar example where we see Leon miss the jab, but that forces Nate to move his head back and to the right, which allows Leon to land a solid straight. In this one, we see the angle change a little bit. When Leon throws that jab, Bilal Muhammad moves his head straight back, which means Leon has to overextend on that left hand, which he does, and he does connect on that left hand. So this time around, Leon's going to change Nate's head movement by using the threat of a counter hook. So Nate is going to pressure, and Leon is going to show this counter hook with his lead hand. That stops Nate from pressuring. So instead of Nate's head moving forward, his head then stops because he stops moving forward. Then Leon can explode with this big left hand that lands really solid. This is probably the clip that you've been waiting for, and what Leon does here is pretty similar to what we've seen in some of his past actions. He uses the straight, and he gets Kamaru to move his head when he throws out that straight. Kamaru dips his head to the right to avoid the straight, and the straight isn't the damaging shot. It is the head kick that is right behind it that Kamaru cannot see because he's moving to his right, and he also has a hand in his face. And Leon lands that head kick and finishes the fight. The second strength that I really liked out of Leon Edwards' game is his ability to dig for underhooks. This is a very important skill to have in grappling, especially in MMA, because a lot of times digging for underhooks is a very good way to defend against takedowns when you're up against the cage. And this is something that Leon does very well, and Leon does have some flaws in his grappling. I'm not telling you that he's a perfect grappler, and I'm not telling you that he does a really good job of digging for the underhook every time. But one thing that is consistent, when Leon is able to defend takedowns, it's always because he's doing a really good job of digging for an underhook or finding an underhook and then using that underhook to get off the cage. So we're going to look at some examples here of some moments where he did a really good job of finding an underhook in a grappling sequence. This is a very simple move by Edwards, and all he does is he slips in an underhook as Kamaru Usman throws strikes. This is very simple, but it puts him in a much more neutral position, and it lets him get his back off the fence. All right, so here Leon is digging for that underhook with his left arm. And all he's going to do is he's going to flip his hips and get his hips off to the outside. That changes the angle, allows him to get his arm past Kamaru's head, and that actually sets up the eventual trip that he landed in the first round. The first aspect of Leon Edwards' game that I do not like is that when he's backed up against the fence, we will see him go to a very defensive high guard position. And I don't really like this because it's not that effective of a defensive position. The high guard is a lot more effective in sports that use bigger gloves. Your boxing glove, your kickboxing gloves. MMA, the gloves are much smaller, which means you can strike around the high guard more effectively and you can split it more effectively with things like jabs and uppercuts. Plus, when your hands are up high and you're in a very defensive position guarding your head, it leaves your body wide open and it's very, very hard to defend against any body shot. And this is something that we saw a lot in his fight with Kamaru Usman, where Usman would back him up against the fence. Edwards would put his hands up, and Usman would just unload with these massive shots. And those would go to the head, they'd go to the body, and Edwards was never really in a great position to defend against those shots. So the clips that we're going to look at for this, a lot of them come from his fight with Usman. All right, so here we see Leon backed up, and he goes to that high guard, and Kamaru just starts throwing shots at that high guard, and he mixes in a couple of body shots that land really well. Once again, in this same position, Usman throws a handful of really solid strikes. This time, an uppercut splits that guard and lands really well. Here we see Leon go high guard again, so Kamaru just rips two massive body shots that both land. And then here we see Leon get so defensive with this hammer block that I don't think he can actually see the massive strikes that Kamaru was loading up. And then adding on to that weakness, this is also bad when it comes to defending takedowns. This is pretty simple. Think about it. If your hands are up, it's very easy for someone to shoot at your hips. It's a lot harder to get your hands down, defend a takedown, dig underhooks, and it's kind of, taking away the previous strength that we talked about of him digging for underhooks, because he keeps his hands plastered to his eyebrows like this. It's very hard to get those hands down in a position where you can defend a takedown. So all Usman had to do in their second fight was throw one or two strikes, get Edwards to go to that high guard, and then he could immediately shoot and get underneath the hips, lock up a really strong takedown, and no matter how good you are at defending the takedown, if you allow the first initial entry, you're not going to stop a takedown. So this is an issue that we saw stemming from his over-reliance on this high guard up against the fence, and that is something that we're going to look at here, and we're going to look at some clips of him getting taken down because he was over-reliant on that high guard. All right, so we already see Edwards in the high guard, and as long as Edwards is in the high guard, all Usman has to do is throw one strike for Edwards to keep his high guard up. If he does that, he can shoot underneath that high guard, get to the hips, and easily land a takedown. Here we see a disengagement in the grappling, but the second they're at space, Usman throws two strikes, Edwards brings his hands up, Kamaru shoots under them, gets to the hips, and gets the takedown. The second weakness that I have in Leon Edwards' game is his fight IQ. Now, I don't think Edwards has a bad fight IQ per se, because he is such a good, mind when it comes to striking. He can set up strikes very well. He times strikes very well. And I think overall, he's good when it comes to striking IQ. But he makes some mistakes that really makes me question his overall fight IQ. This can come in the form, a couple examples that we have is him attempting takedowns against Usman that he really had no business attempting. Another example is him pulling up on the cage to get up, and he didn't need to pull up on the cage. He was in a position where he could have just stood up. So these are examples of things that, why are you doing this? You don't have to do this. This is a bad idea. This is a big mistake. And those, bad ideas and mistakes cost him moments in fights. They cost him positions, and they result in him taking more damage, losing more minutes, which kind of compound into losing a full round. So I don't think Edwards is a dumb guy. I don't think he's a dumb fighter, but I think he makes some silly mistakes that he probably looks back on and goes, "Why did I do that?" So we're gonna look at those clips that I mentioned of just some examples of him making some questionable decisions. All right, so here we're in a clinch position, and apparently Edwards thinks it's a good idea to try and kick out that lead leg of Usman and land a trip. Since Usman's a great wrestler, Edwards ends up on his back. Here we see Edwards finally get his back off the cage. So what does he do? Shoot a double leg takedown. Why? I'm not really sure. I would not consider this smart fight IQ by any means. And then here we see Edwards use the cage to pull himself up. In all honesty, he probably could have gotten up in that position without using the cage. So instead, he ends up back on bottom and gets grappled some more. Now, when it comes to crafting a game plan for Leon Edwards to win a fight, we're going to start with his striking. And the two big things that I want to see him do is kick to all three levels and throw his jab. I think those are very important for him as far as the kicks go. I think if he can land kicks to all three levels, he can find success in a lot of fights. First of all, he has great kicks. So why not mix those to the head, to the body, to the legs? He doesn't throw, any very many complex kicks. He doesn't throw an axe kick out there, for example, but he just throws your standard leg, body, and head kick. But they all do a lot of damage. And I think this is a good way to stack up damage, kind of confuse your opponent when you mix them to all three levels as well. And then with the jab, he has a strong jab that can do damage. And I want to see him throw that jab out there because when he is able to get that jab going, then you can start reading your opponent. So we looked earlier, he throws a jab and the opponent moves in a particular direction. So when you're landing that jab efficiently, those head movements get more, pronounced, where you put in more effort in avoiding that jab. And if you throw the jab more frequently, you have more opportunities to make reads. So if you throw the jab 10 times and the fighter that you're fighting makes the save movement 8 times, then you can start kind of figuring out how he likes to move his head and start making those reads, which then sets up the first strength that we talked about, was him landing strikes when his opponent is moving that head. So I think the jab can help set up some of his stronger skills and also, do damage because he does have a good jab. And then I'd like to see him switch stances and move laterally a little bit more. I think this is something that he doesn't do very often, but I do think he is pretty good when he does it. And I think this is just another layer, another small, layer he can add to his striking to make him go from a really, really good striker to an elite striker. And then I guess one more thing with the striking is the boxing combinations. I do think Leon Edwards is a very underrated boxer. That isn't really the thing that people, think about him for. But I think in positions where he's up against the fence or he's, in an exchange with somebody, I'd like to see him be a little bit more aggressive in putting together a 2, 3, 4-piece combo and mixing to the head and the body, because I do think he's a really good boxer. He has really good hands. I'd like to see him kind of grow in that aspect and be more aggressive. And then in the grappling, the first thing that I want to see Leon Edwards do is mix in his clinch strikes. Leon Edwards has some really good knees and elbows. The elbows, he's landed some very powerful elbows in the past. Look at that elbow he landed against Gunnar Nelson, for example. But he has really good elbows. And I'd like to see Leon, really work to defend takedowns. And then if he's able to defend a takedown, I'd like to see him then mix in knees and elbows in the clinch. Because if you're a fighter and you attempt a takedown, get stuffed, and then get smacked with an elbow, that kind of dissuades you from attempting the takedown again. Because A, you did not get the takedown, and B, you got punished with an elbow as you went to go for the takedown. So I think that is a way where he can kind of not only do damage, but dissuade fighters from taking him down. Because if you're Leon Edwards, being on your back is not a good spot, and against most fighters, you will have an advantage on the feet. Now, if he does get taken down, I want to see him constantly move. Leon Edwards showed some strong scrambles against Kamaru Usman. The problem was he would show a strong scramble, and he would do something good and do something that you like, but it wouldn't work, right? So what I mean by that is you would see him do like a sit-out, more of an MMA sit-out, not your traditional wrestling sit-out, but he would do a sit-out and create some separation and force Kamaru to chain wrestle. Kamaru would win that initial chain wrestling, but then Edwards would stop, right? What I want to see him do is, hit a sit-out, create some separation. If that doesn't work the first time, don't then stop and then let Kamaru control the top position. Move a second time, do a second move, whether that's a stand-up, and start chaining some of these get-up attempts back to back to back, rather than just having one strong attempt that comes up, a little bit short, then add on to that and just constantly move and be a little bit more aggressive in getting up off bottom if his initial, takedown defense doesn't work, or if his initial scramble doesn't work. Add on to that with 1 or 2 more strong movements, because I think there's a lot of times where he's almost up, but then he doesn't get it. I think there's a lot of situations where a little bit more movement, a little bit more work can make that takedown defense or that scramble go from a losing exchange to a winning exchange where he's back on his feet. Now, when it comes to defeating Leon Edwards, I think the biggest thing is being in his face with pressure. When it comes to beating him on the feet, that is. And I say that because if you let him move forward, he can really get in a rhythm. He can really start landing his jab. He can start adding some shots behind that jab. He can throw kicks more efficiently. But if you pressure him and really back him up against the cage, maybe not even necessarily that much. But if you're constantly in his face, he's constantly backing up, he then is not as efficient of a striker. He's a lot better moving forward. Now he can, sit down on counters. I'm not saying he can't counter strike, but if I'm like picking how to fight Leon, I'd rather worry about the counter strikes than worry about letting him get in a rhythm offensively where he is just pressuring you, jab, hook, jab, jab, kick, kick. And then he starts mixing those tools together. So you can really dissuade his rhythm and stop his pressure when you pressure yourself and work in a lot of strong offensive attacks. So put him on the back foot in the striking. And then when it comes to grappling, I think you need to focus on control. And this kind of stems off some previous things we've discussed. But, he will move a little bit and he'll do these things. But if you're able to stifle the initial attempt, he will accept a position up against the cage or a position on bottom. So, what do you do as an offensive grappler? Well, you just focus on getting him down. Get him down, get him down, get him down, right? If you can do that and start getting some controlling positions, and then once Leon, stops moving or accepts a position, that is when you can look to advance or throw some strikes. But I think you need to put a lot of focus on the initial control, right? You don't need to get over aggressive with offensive ground and pound or submission attempts or even advancing position, but control the initial position. If you can continuously control positions, that's when you really start to add up control time. And I guess that's something you can say for any fighter, but I don't think that you should give Leon Edwards a lot of opportunities because he is kind of opportunistic. If you give him something, he will take it, right? He's not as good at creating stand-up opportunities. If you give him one, he's much, much better at taking that. So I think, right, focus on the control. Focus on the control, and then once you have them really controlled, then you can start to add. But focus on control first, and then you can be in a stronger position even later in that sequence or later in the fight to really do some offensive grappling. Thank you for watching this film study on Leon Edwards. If you haven't already, make sure you go and check out some of the other film studies that have been done on the Vendetta Sports Media YouTube channel. Also, make sure you go and check out the website, vendettasportsmedia.com. There's a lot of sports content on that website. It's not just UFC, it's not just MMA. There's a bunch of different sports that you can check out, so make sure you do that as well. But most importantly, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.